Do you ever worry about the future? We live in uncertain times. We've had the strangest year, unprecedented, we've been told. And even as we ease out of lockdown, we continue to feel uneasy and a little wary. And that's just the pandemic. Brexit still looms. The climate crisis deepens. We fear for our economy. And in a global context, it is hard not to feel that life as we have known it is under threat on many levels. I guess it's ever been thus, but at this moment in time, I think we do feel a little uncertain. So just what does the future hold, and what keeps us on track? Can today's reading help us? We've all seen pictures like the one we saw earlier here and images of this story. And this morning, I want to suggest that we focus not on the ascending Christ, but rather on the disciples, their faces upturned and expressing a variety of emotions, wonder, but also anxiety, confusion, puzzlement. The future beckons. What next? The Ascension was a moment of truth for them. Their leader gone, what did it mean? What to do? I want to further suggest that the Ascension holds up a mirror to our own lives as we consider how we live in uncertain times and how we share that deep Christian hope that is within us. The focus then this morning is really on us, on you and on me. As I understand the Christian faith, it requires that I accept the following facts are true. At a certain point in history, a community of men and women came into being around certain events which they believed were of significance, not just for them, but for others. The events were seen to take place in a life which was obviously human. The community's origins lay in a small town called Nazareth in Galilee. The community knew him by a name which was familiar in their culture. His name was Jesus. Some of those who came to know him well also knew his mother. She stayed in the town where her son had grown up and where she had lived with her husband, Joseph. Joseph was a father whom their friend Jesus remembered with affection, although he never spoke of him directly, or at least none of them recorded it later. Jesus of Nazareth lived a human life in such a way that those who met him were first drawn to him and then captivated by him. Finally, they were driven to a certain conclusion. They realized that this person somehow embodied the ultimate qualities of existence, which up to now they had believed to be qualities of God alone, totally beyond the capacity of human life. This realization did not happen at once. It was a gradual process, I guess, in much the same way that we develop our relationships. There would have been shared experiences, fears discovered, affection shared, and finally, a deep love known. These people then witnessed the betrayal and destruction of all that. If they had not been able to face it or were not in Jerusalem at that time, they later heard of the brutal and shameful death. They were traumatized, they hid, they fled from the area. The community that had begun to emerge now began to disintegrate. Then something of immense significance took place. They tell us that when some of them went to the tomb where others had laid the obviously dead body of Jesus, that body was not there. They tell us that some of them who had no expectation of ever looking again into his eyes or hearing his voice, or least of all touching him, found themselves doing exactly those things. So in that way, they began what we might call the second stage of their relationship with him. It was different from the first stage. He was what he had been before the horror of the cross, but they also make it clear that he was more, much more. They don't try to explain, it seems to be beyond explanation. Perhaps we might say that Jesus' relationship with matter, time, and space was somehow changed. He was still very much of matter. They had indeed touched him. He had eaten with him. But he no longer seemed to be imprisoned as we are by time and space. While he was among his followers in Jerusalem, he was with them too in Galilee. He had become, in words that we know so well, the risen Christ. But this too had to end, because that long ago community of disciples were ordinary, limited human beings. It was ended then in a way that they could, as ordinary human beings, understand. It is not a moment which can be explained and analysed and in that way understood. It is the moment we have come to call the Ascension of Christ. A moment which Christians regard as the ending of the second mode of Christ's presence among us and the beginning of something new. But those early disciples had come to understand certain things. They had learnt that all they had come to love and expect from him would now have to be sought, discovered, and nurtured among themselves. Now it was their hands clasped in prayer or reaching out in service, which must become channels of his grace and healing and power. They began to recall with increasing clarity his words and his actions. This is what he had tried so often to tell them. They must together be the body through which his divine will would be made real through time and history. Did they come to this understanding easily? Of course not, and we grapple with it still. In one way, we become blinded by its familiarity, and yet in another way, we never succeed in accepting it. And indeed, isn't this the wonder of it, that across the centuries, through water, bread, and wine and word, those disciples, that long ago community, have become us, and we have become them. We see our own human fallibility. We see the flawed and ineffective church. How can such frail and ordinary vessels be the instruments of God's will? Perhaps it helps us to remind ourselves that this first community was already flawed. And yet the task of being Christ on earth, of moving forward the will and purposes of God, is given to them, and so it follows to us. We wrestle with our contemporary human situation. We are faced with many threats, including in the past year, a pesky little virus. Even as Christians, we know that we are dangerously divided. We are too often frightened by the future. We feel inadequate, overwhelmed, conflicted even. We are not sure we like what we have become. Day after day, our news bulletins confront us with war, abuse, racism, man's inhumanity to man. And yet we believe that somewhere within our humanity burns the flame, the image of God. Indeed, in the midst of struggle, do we not catch a glimpse, tantalizing and fleeting may be, of heaven on earth? With us, as with that little group who long ago witnessed the mysterious event we call the Ascension, something simple yet immense happens. Christ accepts our lack of self-confidence in ourselves. He accepts the dark areas of our humanity. He accepts our capacity for deceit and betrayal and greed. And having accepted us, he calls us, each one of us, and gives us this ongoing mission to be his people in the world, loving and caring and healing. And this is what we seek to be as God's people here, the body of Christ, many parts, working together in so many different ways. And that, of course, leads us neatly back to next Sunday when we celebrate our life together, not just Steinbeck, but all of us. And then on to Pentecost. Pentecost, which changes the picture once more. God's Spirit giving the disciples, giving us the confidence and the trust that we need for the task in hand, holding and keeping us, reminding us of the love that holds us, keeping us on track, always. Thanks be to God.